Hi everybody, I'm Yara El Safi. I am a queer Muslim immigrant, also a performer and a visual artist. I went to Western Ontario for art. I did specialization in studio work and a minor in studies. So those kind of two things come a lot in my work, especially when it comes to like concepts and understanding my work is very much under the guise of women's studies, understanding the body, how the body is consumed visually, commercially, and so on and so forth. And my exhibition, Bread and Salt, is about different levels of consumption of the female body, but also the queer female body. Also just experiences of people who are on the margins or other direct intersections. So as you can see, my work back there they are three different iterations of kind of like plates of food, as I would say. There are stockings with like dried legumes. The reason I put them together and the way I kind of framed it was that being at the intersections of the East and West, I've always kind of like, I was born in Dubai, and I was raised in Lebanon, and then I immigrated here when I was 9 with my family, and so I always was really sensitive to how different the environments were, both socially and environmentally. Things are different, but also very similar. The thing that I noticed across the board was that female and feminine bodies are constantly at work and working really hard and stuff, but never get credit. So these pieces are about how the female body in food are like your grandma and your mother are always making food, but they're not considered chefs. All the people who get roles in that are usually men who perfect this craft that's passed on maternally, because most societies are matriarchal. So the lagoons kind of represent a lot of like the food from Lebanon. So we have a lot of dried food because we lived through civil war, and for most of our existence as a country, we suffered through multiple civil wars, which not only gave us PTSD, but then generational trauma that's passed down. And so a lot of things kind of end up going to the side, other than like people who are poor, and then people who are LGBTQ in the community kind of get pushed to the side. And so your body becomes disenfranchised in multiple different ways. And so for me, being in the kitchen with my mother was something that I experienced a lot, and seeing that my uncles were chefs, but my grandma and my mother were just cooks, were kind of like a weird thing that I just never really understood. And also, I like to use a lot of, as you can tell, if you walk through, there's texture, but there's also smell. And I like to use smell in my work because smell is actually the closest thing to memory in the brain. And so it will like kind of trigger you to have other experiences other than just visually seeing this thing that's kind of odd. The placemats were made to represent the placemats that we have back home, because we actually eat on the floor usually traditionally, and so we have these placemats where all the food bowls and things would be. So there is explanation of that. I also wanted to, one second, sorry. Yeah, so this back here, so the scenes that you see are going to be the last 3 scenes. The reason I put them is because I didn't want to like spoil the movie. But also, they're the 3 last scenes of my 25-minute documentary, not all skies are just blue, sorry. And then there's also the last scene that you see of me in my traditional abaya, which is a traditional like celebration wear in blue, was to reference the blue sky of just like that also has a blue, are kind of like circulating, because these are all narratives of people who live through the LGBTQ community in Canada. The 2 brothers live in Montreal, and then we don't have his name, we've never really met him, it was more of like a phone conversation. He's a trans man that lives in Vancouver. And so this movie came out, actually the way that it was all put together was through an Instagram post. Someone contacted me through Instagram and they were like, we want to do this featured movie. And we're in Montreal. And I was like, this seems a little fake. But it ended up not being fake at all. And it was a really kind of cool collaboration between these students that were working at the University of Montreal in film. And they wanted to put this documentary together. And so we had a month to film. We filmed 2 days in Toronto where I was living, and then 2 days in Montreal. And so it's a non-linear documentary that basically kind of tries to put in a non-opinionated narrative of like people's lives living in those margins. And so like my experience versus these brothers' experience are very different, even though they basically come from the same part of the world as me. They're from Jordan, I'm from Lebanon. But the thing is that I lived at the intersections of like growing up there and then living here after my teenage years versus them, and they go back and forth with their family all the time. They're actually doing really well. One of them was in the New York Fashion Week recently, so that's kind of cool. So yeah, they're kind of like windows of people's realities without like that there's some sort of conclusion to people's lives. It's just like that's just the reality of those people, and that's just what seems to happen. So yeah, and to close everything off, I wanted to kind of mention what bread and salt actually means. So in the Lebanese dialect of Arabic, bread and salt, if you're to translate it, means the construction of social trust. So back home, because the Civil War took so much things away from us, such as food and things that we weren't used for entertainment, bread and salt was the only thing that you could have with somebody, that you could share with them during the Civil War, that would like bring trust to you. Because if you feed someone bread and salt, that means that there's some sort of like exchange there. And so the screening of this, and also the work that you are consuming, is the idea of social trust from me as a person who lives on the margins to the public. So, yeah. So I enjoyed the movie.